Hi there and welcome to the second in our series of Lent courses based on this book, God and the Pandemic, which many of you have read. You don't have to though if you're going to follow the course, that's fine. And last week, if you remember, I asked you to think about, look at some bits of the Old Testament. If you haven't had time, don't worry. Suffice it to say, there are bits of the Old Testament where people complain to God or see sad things going on and don't understand. Okay, that was what we looked at when we talked about the book of Lamentations, book of Job, and some of the Psalms are the same as well. But to start with this week, remember this course is also all about groaning. And this week I'd like to start off with something that might make some of you really groan, which is maths. Now, this pandemic has brought maths into our homes like nothing else. And we've been addressed with some very scary figures each day about people who've been contracting the virus, people who died from it very sadly, and other things. We've also had to think about statistics, in particular the R number, which talks about how you might infect people and what the rate of infection is in the country as a whole. So maths has come to us in a big way. And this week we're particularly thinking about the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there is a big equation which comes especially in the book of Deuteronomy. If you do this, then this will happen. But to get us thinking about equations, I want to just give you some to start with to see if you can remember these and remember what they're about. Here's the first one, which most people know, even if you've never done any maths before or know very little about maths. You might have heard of this one. E equals mc squared. Now, many of you know that comes from Einstein, and it's to do with energy and mass. Don't ask me to explain it because I can't. I'm not clever enough. But E equals mc squared is a formula. This is the same as that. Okay, we get that idea, don't we? Here's another one you may remember from school if you stayed awake in maths. This is thinking about triangles, particularly about right-angled triangles. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That's where C is the hypotenuse. It means the long line opposite the right angle. And if you're smart, you might remember that's Pythagoras' theory, which I have to say I've never used in my life. Although you might do if you're, I don't know, a carpet fitter or something like that. If you do things which involve triangles, this might be quite an important formula for you. What about this one? V minus E plus F equals 2. And that, of course, as you all know, is Euler's formula for polyhedra. In other words, the way of calculating how many edges a polyhedron may have. Polyhedron, of course, is a many-sided shape, as we all know. Now, that probably sent a shiver down your spine, remembering maths from many years ago. But in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a huge, big formula which kind of sums up the Old Testament, although as we'll see later, it's not always true. Now, just to refresh your memory, the book of Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Bible, and this is at a time when the people of Israel come out of Egypt. They're poised to go into the promised land. Moses is reaching the very end of his life. God said to him, unfortunately, you won't go into the promised land. So Moses knows this is like his swan song. This is his last chance to warn and remind the people of Israel what to do. Because imagine this very old man stood on a rock with all this great multitude of people gathered around him, and he's giving his last speech to them. And it's very much a formula. If, then this will happen. So it starts in chapter 26. The Lord your God commands you this day to follow these decrees and laws. Carefully observe them with all your heart and with all your soul. Don't forget the law of God. If you do, remember, then this is the sort of thing you can expect. If you remember, it says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. That's not bad, is it? All these blessings will come to you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. So either way, you'll be blessed. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? If you obey, then this will happen. It's an equation, isn't it? Now, Moses didn't need to use the word if when it came to disobeying, because he knew what the people of Israel were like. He knew after 40 years of running them, he knew exactly what they were like, and he knew that they were likely to turn away from God. So he says this in chapter 31, "For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and to turn from the way I've commanded you." He knew it was going to happen. In the days to come, disaster will fall on you because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord and arouse his anger by what your hands have made. There he's talking about idols, isn't he? People will turn their back on God and worship other things. So the Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You will come at them from one direction, but flee from them in 7. And you will become a thing of horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So here's the formula. If you follow God, good things. If you turn your back on God, bad things. I want us to stop here for a minute and think about how we have formulas of our own in our heads, or perhaps things we've been taught from our parents or learnt through the hardships of life. Are there things we can say that are definitely true? If you do this, this will happen. I'll give you an example. Pride comes before a fall. That's a really good proverb, isn't it? Or maybe this one. What goes around comes around. If you do bad things, they'll come back and get you. Have a think for a minute. Is there anything you can say that's a proverb or a teaching or a rule in life that you know is 99% true and you can predict it will happen? Have a think for a moment. So there kind of are rules in life which you could say do happen. If you do this, then you're likely to do it. If you smoke, you're very likely to end up with some terrible lung disease. There are kind of rules in life where if this happens, then this will be the consequence. But you could say that the general rule in the Old Testament, and I say the general rule, it's not always true, is if you forget God, God may well forget about you, or something worse could happen to you. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, which by the way are the same psalm, they accidentally included the same psalm twice when they were compiling the book of Psalms, starts with these words: "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And as a result, the fool who forgets God, bad things will happen to them. And whether you're a Christian or not, there are rules in the pandemic that we can say are there and will follow on. Rules made by the government about how many people are allowed to gather together. And we've seen examples in the news of where people break these rules, and not always, but sometimes they suffer quite horrendous consequences. What about this rule? If you have the vaccine, you will be 90% likely to be protected from the virus. Well, that's quite good, isn't it? That's an encouragement for us to get the vaccine. There are rules around us right now. But the passage I asked you to look at in the Old Testament, and we're thinking about the Old Testament particularly this week, come from books and times where people had tried to follow God. But it seems that even though they've been good people, God appears to have forgotten about them. And we know examples from our lives where, whether you're a Christian or not, good people can sometimes suffer bad fates for no apparent reason. Now here's some people in the Old Testament who you could say they may have felt that God had forgotten them through no fault of their own. Abraham. In the book of Genesis, Abraham is the first person that God has a really close friendship with. He makes all sorts of wonderful promises. You will be a prosperous man. Many nations on earth will be your descendants. What a fantastic promise. In fact, God said your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. There's quite a few of them, isn't there? What a wonderful promise. But how do you think Abraham felt when he was reaching the age of 100 and unfortunately hadn't had any children yet? And his wife was most definitely barren. How would that have made him feel? Perhaps occasionally forgotten by God. Or what about Joseph, Abraham's great-great-great-great-grandson, who had all these marvellous promises about how all his brothers would bow down to him because he'd be a great and wonderful, important person. And there he is in prison on a false accusation. How do you think Joseph would have felt? Maybe forgotten by God? I don't know. Moses, as I said before, must have had many times when he felt that God had forgotten him. He was in horrendous situations, threatened by the people he'd been asked to lead because they were unhappy with his leadership. David, when he was a teenager, when he was a young lad, was told that he would be king. He was anointed king. But how long did it take him to actually become king? Quite a long time. He must have felt disheartened many times, especially when he was on the run from Saul, the king he was supposed to replace. Elijah, the prophet, hundreds of years later, bad king, wonderful man, but in a bad time. He must have felt, well, he did say, to cry out to God and say, I'm the only one left. There's no one else. You must have forgotten all about this nation you're supposed to look after. And of course, most of all, Job. I asked you if you'd like to have a look at that book. It's an interesting book. It comes among all the wisdom literature, all the bits of the Bible dedicated to teaching you wisdom. But what happened to Job? A good man, a wonderful husband and father, family man who feared God, but everything was taken away from him. And here's a bit of what Job says to God. Sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. Remember, this is a course all about groaning. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, only turmoil. These are people in the Bible, in the Old Testament, who felt that despite all their best efforts, God had forgotten them. And in the Psalms, we see quite a few Psalms where people feel exactly that and they cry out to God in their pain. Psalm 22 is a good example. My God, why have you forsaken me? These are the words that Jesus cries out on the cross, isn't it? This feeling that God has completely abandoned us. Psalm 44 is another one to look at. Remember all the good times, God. Well, we went out to battle. Where were you? We lost. We were right on your side. We felt that you were with us. We were doing all the right things. We were worshipping you. We did all the things you'd expect a good nation to do. But we lost the battle. What's happened there? Or Psalm 88, the cry of somebody who feels totally abandoned. Illness has come upon them. Loneliness. This is something we've all felt during lockdown to some degree or other. In the book that we're following, of course, Tom Wright suggests that this might be the thoughts of Jesus in his cell the day before he's led out to the cross. This feeling of loneliness and despondency. So we've been thinking about the Old Testament and this formula. If you do this, then this will happen. If you walk away from God, then bad things will follow. But we've seen that some people who don't walk away from God still have the bad things happening to them. So I want to have another think now, and I want to think about this idea of karma, this idea of bad things will follow on from people who turn their back on God or people who just do bad things. Here's a question for you. Supposing you know somebody who's an anti-vaxxer. By that I mean somebody who actively protests against the vaccine, who puts things on social media saying they don't believe the vaccine is right and the COVID infection is all made up. Supposing you met somebody who was just like that, who suddenly became infected with COVID, and they ring you on your mobile phone or whatever, what would you say to them? Interesting thought, isn't it? Have a think. It's very easy, isn't it, when people do things like this to say, aha, serves you right. And I spoke last week about how some Christians have blamed people in the world for bringing the pandemic on themselves. It's God's judgment on you, serves you right. Now, the Old Testament, there's lots of examples of where the Deuteronomy formula, if you do this, then this will happen, seems to come true. But the Old Testament isn't all like that. We tend to think of it as God being a God of judgment, but it isn't always the way. If you look at the book of Isaiah, especially chapters 40 to 66, there's quite a lot there about God restoring Israel. Just to remind you that the nation had been taken into captivity. Israel and Judah had both been taken away to Babylon into captivity. And that's why we get the book of Lamentations. Look at this desolate city that's been ransacked and destroyed. But in chapter 40 of Isaiah, the prophet speaks of Israel being comforted, coming back. There's hope. There's something good around the corner. On a day like today, when there's sunshine around, and when we listen to the news about the figures coming down, about the possibility of being able to mix with people in June, it all feels a little bit more promising. And hope is a wonderful thing, isn't it? But no matter how much you look at Isaiah 40 and hear this message of hope and restoration, there's still the problem of this formula. If you do this, then this will happen. How can we break the formula? There's only one thing that will break the formula, and that's God's grace. What do we mean there? God going beyond just simply saying, if you do this, the punishment will follow. It's God being kind, God being forgiving, God going that extra mile to look after us and to forgive us and to restore us. And again with Isaiah, if you look at chapter 53, it's a very famous passage about the suffering servant, the person who will bring all this restoration at their own cost. You know this passage. I'll just read a bit to you. It's very famous. Surely he, this is the suffering servant, took up our pain and bore our suffering. We considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. That's sin. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. That's speaking about us forgetting God, isn't it? And ignoring him. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So God's grace is there to bring us back, to restore us. But it's through the suffering servant. And if you know anything about the faith, you'll know who that servant is. Of course, it's Jesus. And next week, we'll be thinking more especially about Jesus and how Jesus has broken this formula that we see. going back to the Old Testament. So today we've thought about the formula, and we've also thought about how God is bigger than this formula, going back to the book of Deuteronomy. So for next time, I want you to think about Jesus, the suffering servant, and what he means, what grace means, what God's forgiveness and extra kindness to our world actually means. You may find it helpful to read one of the Gospels. I recommend the Gospel of Mark. It's fairly short, it moves along at a fast pace. And if you want to remind yourself of what Jesus does, who he is, and what the gospel message is, the book of Mark will be a very good place to start off from. But here's something else I'd like you to think about doing if you get the chance, if you've got enough time. How about writing a psalm of lament to God? We talked about these psalms where people cry out to God because they feel unfairly treated. Well, you don't have to feel like that, but we all know how it feels to feel neglected, to feel sorry for ourselves, not necessarily angry at God, but to know how it feels that the world has passed us by, and to cry out to God for something better to come along. Now, it doesn't have to be a long piece of work, it doesn't have to rhyme, it doesn't have to win a poetic prize, but just something that cries out from your heart to God about the situation we're in at the moment. Now, here's one I prepared earlier. It's not long, you'll be glad to know. It's a short cry of lament, a short psalm. I'm sure you could write something better than this. How long, Lord? I'm sick of daytime TV. I want to see my friends. A sit-down meal together would be great. I miss having live songs on a Sunday morning. I miss opt-in on Tuesdays. I miss our prayer breakfasts. I miss school assemblies. And I miss hugs. I hope things will change soon. And I know, God, that you will do some cool new stuff. Amen. See you next time, and have a think about writing a psalm like that, and read Mark's Gospel as we prepare to see what effect Jesus has on our groaning world. See you later.